A warm welcome to you all to today's webinar. We're really excited to have you, and we're hosting today in partnership with Philanthropy New York. My name is Sarah Martin, and I'm the manager of the Programming and External Relations team at Center for Effective Philanthropy. And the theme for today's discussion is how foundations are responding to the U.S. Supreme Court affirmative action rulings. This is also the title of CEP's brand new research snapshot, which we'll hear about today as well. CEP Research Snapshots are a new publication series at CEP of brief data-informed research designed to answer timely and specific questions relevant to funders. For those of you tuning in who are new to CEP, I'd love to share a little bit about us. Our work is focused on philanthropic effectiveness, and for over 2 decades, we've sought to help foundations and increasingly individual donors to improve their effectiveness and increase their impact. We do this through assessments and research reports that often lift up the perspectives of those who wouldn't otherwise be heard, as well as programs like this one. We're a nonprofit and rely on grants and contributions to support our research and programs, so please reach out if you're interested in supporting us. Our calendar for opting into a round of grantee, donor, or staff surveys this year is nearly full, so please reach out if you work at a grant-making institution and would like to learn more about our assessments. I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items today before we get started. So first of all, we're in a webinar format, which means you all are muted and have your videos off upon entering the session. If you have questions today, and we really hope you do, please type them into the Q&A box in your Zoom control panel at the bottom of the screen. We'll try to be as responsive as possible during the Q&A portion. We will not be using the hand raising function as we're not asking attendees to speak their questions. And if you require some kind of technical assistance, please reach out to my colleague, Say Darling, at saed@cep.org. And I'll put all of this information in the chat for you all. We'll also be sharing some resources, speaking of the chat, via the chat box. So feel free to check there for any helpful links. If you'd like to enable closed captioning, you can do so in your Zoom control panel by clicking More and Captioning. And finally, this webinar is being recorded and we will send a link to all registrants. Now that housekeeping is out of the way, I want to pass it to Yicheng Lin, Vice President of Learning at Philanthropy New York, our partner for today's webinar, to share a brief welcome.
Thank you so much, Say, and thank you, Sarah. I'm sorry. Thank you so much, Sarah and Say, and our colleague at CEP. And thank you to our terrific panelists who will be sharing their work today. Welcome and good afternoon. As Sarah said, my name is Yicheng Lin, and I oversee programming and learning here at Philanthropy New York. For those of you who are new to Philanthropy New York, we are a regional association of New York Metro grant makers. Our membership consists of 280 grant-making institutions with over 5,000 engaged community members. Our theory of change is to bring together our members through programs, networks, and working groups to spark questions that lead them to create the conditions in which they can shift their philanthropic practices, both internally and externally with their nonprofit partners. So we are so delighted to be in partnership with CEP today to offer this timely program, sharing CEP's snapshot in time in which foundations have self-reported their intentions to stay the course with regards to race-informed grant-making strategies in the wake of the SCOTUS ruling on affirmative action. And we want to acknowledge and not undermine the validity of the real concerns and pushback we have heard from grant-making staff and nonprofits during this current environment. So we have invited panelists to share some of the ways in which foundations are and have been staying the course and/or are leaning into their racial equity work. As they share their journeys, I invite you to listen through the lens of your varying roles and positions, your spheres of influence, and ask yourself, where can we continue to make shifts in our practices? I also want to share that Philanthropy New York is planning on a follow-up conversation for our members with the intention of creating a space for funders to reflect on what they've heard today and exchange learnings as their practices continue to evolve. So thank you again for joining us, and I'll pass it back to Sarah.
Thanks so much, Yicheng. And thank you all for being here. Now I have the privilege of introducing our moderator for today. Alicia Smith Arriaga is CEP's Vice President of Research and leads the creation, development, analysis, and release of many of our research projects relevant to the sector's most pressing issues. She'll be moderating our fantastic panel and presenting the data from our affirmative action snapshot. Alicia, over to you.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm excited to share with you today the data from the new report CEP recently released on the Supreme Court's, how foundations are responding to the Supreme Court's affirmative action rulings. I'm going to share my screen now, and hopefully everyone can see the slides. So first, I want to thank the CEP research team, especially John Munoz, who was the author of this report, and everyone on the team who played important roles in moving this work forward. And we really jumped into this work when I actually joined CEP last June, and also last June in 2023, the Supreme Court ruled against university policies that take race directly into account for admissions. Now, in the wake of these rulings, there was concern that the court's decisions could have a chilling effect on philanthropic efforts that support racial equity. This new CEP research sets out to determine whether foundations are walking away from or continuing to support these efforts. Now, as Sarah mentioned, I'm very excited to be joined today, and I'll bring on the panelists after I present the data, but wanted to go ahead and share a little bit about each of them. But the esteemed guests we're going to have joining us will be both discussing their reactions to the report once I share the data and the work their organizations have been doing in the wake of the rulings. Rakiba Labrie is Vice President of Programs at the San Francisco Foundation. She previously served as a Program Director of College Success at the Haas Junior Fund and for more than 13 years at the Open Society Foundation. Eloy Ortiz Oakley is CEO of the College Futures Foundation. He is also a University of California Regent and was previously Chancellor of the California Community Colleges. And Dr. Akilah Watkins is President and CEO of Independent Sector. Previously, Dr. Watkins was a President and CEO for the Center for Community Progress. And in December 2023, under Dr. Watkins' leadership, Independent Sector, along with the Council on Foundations, filed an amicus brief in support of the Fearless Foundation. Given each of their deep backgrounds in philanthropy and the nonprofit sector, I'm excited to hear from each of our guests after we share the data today. Now, following the Supreme Court's rulings on affirmative action in college admissions, there has been much in the media about uncertainty on how to move forward with efforts to support racial equity in the nonprofit sector. There was even more attention in fall 2023 when the American Alliance for Equal Rights filed a lawsuit against the Atlanta-based Fearless Foundation, an organization led by Black women that helps combat underfunding and venture capital by providing grants, tools, and mentorship to women of color. As this was playing out in June 2023, we worked together on the research team to develop a new CEP research product, the CEP Research Snapshot. The idea was to develop and turn around quickly, brief, data-informed research publications designed to answer timely, specific questions that are relevant to funders. This particular research snapshot is the first in the series and focuses on how foundations are responding to the Supreme Court's affirmative action rulings. Now, for this first snapshot, we sent a survey to all foundations that give at least $5 million annually. We collected this information from September through early November 2023, and we had 280 foundations respond to the survey for a 34% response rate. We also asked survey respondents if they would be willing to be contacted for a follow-up interview so we could learn more. We were able to conduct interviews with 17 foundation leaders in October 2023. Now, before we dig into this data, I want to note that our findings should be interpreted with two important caveats in mind. First, the repercussions of the Supreme Court's decision are still playing out, and foundations' responses may change over time. The long-term effects of the decision on philanthropy will, of course, only be fully visible in grant-making decisions and strategy decisions that will play out over time. Second, as with any survey, there may be some non-responder bias at play. It's certainly possible that those that shifted their grant-making in response to the decision were less likely to respond, though at this time, we have no clear data to support that. Now, let's turn to what we found in these data. Key finding 1. More than half of foundations surveyed, 53%, have had or are planning to have internal discussions about the implications of the U.S. Supreme Court rulings on their work. This quote from one of the interviews illustrates much of what we were hearing from foundation leaders. As one leader said, our board has affirmed the importance of staying the course in our grant-making strategy that sees racial equity as key to achieving health equity and justice. Now, in key finding 2, we see that more than 1/3 of foundations have had or are planning to have discussions with their grantees about the implications of the Supreme Court's ruling on the foundation's work. While 63% of foundations had no plans for discussions with grantees, the other 37% had either had discussions with grantees or were planning to have discussions in the near future. And once again, this is in fall 2023. This quote illustrates much of what we were hearing from foundation leaders. We will be working with our applicants and grantees to see how they are affected as an organization, understanding how they are addressing it to the extent affected. We will be discussing with organizations in general and other funders about their experience. We will be involved at some level in public policy work. Now, key finding 3. Approximately 3 out of 10 foundations have consulted legal counsel about the implications of the Supreme Court rulings on their work. One leader mentioned, "We are mindful of the risks the ruling poses related to some of our activities. We have not changed anything, but will consult with counsel as needed going forward as we continue to implement our EDI action plan." Now, up to this point, we've described whether foundations overall have been having these discussions about the Supreme Court's rulings on affirmative action and college admissions. But when we look at the breakdown by whether a foundation is being led by a person of color, we see some important differences in key finding 4. Here, we see that discussions about the implications of the Supreme Court rulings are less likely to take place at foundations that are not led by a person of color, regardless of whether a foundation is funding social justice work. As you can see here, leaders of foundations who identify as a person of color have a significantly higher likelihood of having discussions internally with grantees and with legal counsel. And beyond what you see here, even at foundations that fund social justice work, this difference persists. Leaders who are not people of color are less likely to be having these discussions that are relevant to their work. As one leader said, race remains one of the most defining issues in this country that we've yet to get right. And turning away from it at this moment would be a wrong decision. We want to lean into the discomfort. We want to lean into understanding the histories and structures of racism. And for us as a foundation, and for me as CEO, I feel it's my charge to continue on that path and not stop, and definitely not go backwards. Key finding 5. The majority of foundations are not making changes to their ongoing work as a result of these internal discussions. So between September and November 2023, in the immediate aftermath of the court's rulings, the majority of foundation leaders reported not making any changes to their ongoing work at that time. Specifically, 76% of foundations that reported having internal conversations reported not making changes to their ongoing work. One foundation leader noted, "We have discussed the ruling and we reviewed legal expertise on the topic as it may relate to an organization like ours, but we have not procured our own opinion because we don't think we have significant exposure at this time. We are keeping abreast of the jurisprudence as it develops, but we don't think that it presents imminent need for change in our work." So of foundations that shared they were having internal conversations, 24% of those shared they were making changes such as the kinds, the 2 described here. Removing language that could be construed as race-specific or increasing support for programs that target specific racial communities. This first quote provides an example of removing language that could be construed as race-specific. We are still committed to our program vision in support of racial equity, but may have to change how we discuss it the language in our grant criteria, etc. This second quote provides an example of increasing support for programs that target specific racial communities. We are increasing our support of organizations led by and serving people with lived experience in our foundation's interest areas who are also BIPOC. In sum, these data show that at least in fall 2023, while most foundations we surveyed were discussing the rulings internally, few planned to make changes. And some were, in fact, leaning into racial equity work more deeply. Thank you. I'm excited to invite our panelists back into the conversation for a discussion about these findings and their current work, and about how the environment is shifting rapidly in this moment around this issue. Right. Welcome, Rakiva, Akila, and Eloy. Thanks so much for joining us today. And I'm going to start out with a question. You know, this data is from one point in time in November 2023. And we know that the field is shifting quickly around this topic. So what are your reactions to these findings in the current context? Do they align with your current experience?
I'm happy to jump in, Alicia, and first of all, thank you for having me, and thank you for the work that you're leading. From my perspective, as you mentioned, this is a point in time, and things are changing fast. From our perspective, we are leaning in harder on this issue of providing cover for leaders in California. Around this issue, we feel that words like diversity, equity, and inclusion are not bad three-letter words. They are part of the important work that we want to do to increase the availability of talent in the workforce here in California and throughout the nation. And so we do see it as an important role to take to ensure that there is no backsliding. There is certainly always discussion about whether or not some organizations in the state and throughout the country are as aggressive as they were before the ruling. And so we just see it as our role to continue to push those organizations and create the space for this, because it is not just a matter of arguing the ruling for the sake of arguing. It's continuing to create the space that certainly our learners in California deserve, and ensuring that leaders who want to continue to do this work have the space to do it.
Yeah, consistent with Eloy's response, I first want to thank you for inviting me to join this discussion. I'm a California native, but I lived in New York for more than 20 years, so I'm particularly delighted to be on a joint CEP and Philanthropy New York panel because it affirms all my parts. But in answer to your question, I wasn't surprised by the findings, especially given that the survey was done 3 to 5 months after the decision came down. What you captured aligns with my experience at the San Francisco Foundation. We are explicit and unapologetic in our commitment to racial equity and economic inclusion. We have a Black CEO, Fred Blackwell. We have talked about what the ruling means for our race-forward grant-making approach and really are committed to staying the course. I have to say what jumped out at me most was that foundations that are led by people of color are more likely to be talking about the rulings. And I think this is a really double-edged data point. For many of us as people of color, this ruling is personal. It's just another attempt to sow doubt about whether we belong and to question our talent. And it's also a part of a really coordinated, vicious attempt to roll back decades of progress. So on the one hand, it makes sense to me that BIPOC CEOs would have more discussions about the impact of the rulings because race is so salient in most everything that BIPOC folks do. On the other hand, I felt like for BIPOC CEOs, they may feel a greater sense of urgency because of the awareness that BIPOC leaders are more vulnerable, that we are more likely to have a target on our back when we're trying to advance transformative, equity-driven change. And I can't help but think of Claudine Gay as a prime example of that. And for BIPOC leaders, questions of survival may be more immediate as they're processing this decision. So I just wanted to bring that into the space.
So, Keela from Independent Sector, and would love to thank Center for Effective Philanthropy for this invite today. And there's a lot in this question. So I will say this, I do think it's a point in time. And I think in some ways we won't know the full impact of this decision for quite a while. So, in some ways it's going to be a lag outcome here. I will just tell you at Independent Sector, we are the national membership organization that brings together philanthropy, large, small, mid-sized nonprofits, and corporate social responsibility arms. So, I get to be in these conversations a lot, and I will tell you a few things, and then there's some things we can point to publicly. Do I think people are changing their mission statements? I think, our organizations, and I think this is a wonderful thing about the sector, is that they are extremely diverse in thought, racially diverse, in a lot of ways. And so I do think that staff members are a lot of the staff members I talk to, a lot of the presidents and CEOs are totally in line with going harder and investing more in DEI. And, I think they're sort of holding the complexity of how to get this work past, just some of their trustees, right? Who may not be steeped in certain communities in the same way that leaders are. So I've heard this, from leaders, of all backgrounds that are deeply committed to this work, but also have to just hold the reality and the complexity of having to be internally strategic with their boards. And that is causing huge challenges. I think too is we're just spending a lot of time and resources on, and in some ways, I think the Supreme Court decision, like, if you ask me, like, what's the damage it's done, that's the sort of core damage, because, there's so many challenges that our organizations are tackling these days. And the fact that we have to pull resources away and time and attention and focus on defending our right to be at the table and deeply investing in communities that have historically been disinvested in. And we are having to have conversations that we've had 40 years ago again. I think in some ways is a huge tragedy. And then finally, one of the sort of more public cases is around the Fearless Foundation. And this is a case, I probably will talk about it later on, but, this case actually, was, this was a venture capitalist fund that was against sort of Black women entrepreneurs, and they were sort of sued by the same organization that went to court around this, around the Harvard and University of North Carolina's decision around affirmative action. So this feels very targeted, very strategic, and Independent Sector, along with council and foundations, we actually prepared an amicus brief to defend the right of funders to be able to have philanthropic freedom that is steeped in justice and equity. And that for Black women who have historically not received a lot of the capital needed to create businesses, was an opportunity for them, and that opportunity is being threatened. And I think that is also another tragedy of all of this, is that there are a lot of great work happening in so many of our BIPOC communities. And we want to make sure that dollars can continue to flow, and these communities have an opportunity to thrive. And so all of this, what this sort of case has done is brought all of this back into question. And again, that's some of the real tragedy behind it.
Yeah, thanks so much to each of you for sharing just your reactions. And, Akila, especially that last piece around the distraction from the work itself and moving the work forward. And my next question, I would really love to hear from each of you about, kind of given that context we just talked about, are there examples from your current work around this topic that you feel would be helpful for the field to just know more about?
I would say from our perspective here at College Futures, you highlighted in your opening comments, and I think Akila just mentioned this as well, is the importance of providing support for leaders of color in this space. Prior to the Supreme Court decision, our organization supported a study that looked into the norms that surround the hiring of college and university presidents. It highlighted how leaders of color make very different kinds of decisions, or at least take different things into consideration when making decisions. We feel that this is a very important part of how we navigate the environment. Leaders of color, particularly leaders of color who have grown up in similar situations that our learners face, think about those experiences when they're making decisions and are willing to lean into issues, regardless of what perhaps their legal counsels may be telling them. They will lean into it in different ways. So we see that that's an important role that we have, is highlighting the importance, not just arguing for diversity's sake, but showing where diversity in talent pools and leadership actually has very positive effects on the economy, on the way learners express themselves in communities, and in states like California. I mean, whether you're in California, Texas, Florida, wherever you are, the future of those states relies on the talent pool that exists in those states, and those talent pools are very diverse in nature. So that's one example. The other example is just how we fund leadership development. We fund a lot of leadership development in the state of California for leaders of institutions of higher learning. And we really want to ensure that these questions are baked in. How are they going to navigate in environments like we see ourselves in? And for the foreseeable future, it's going to get worse, not better, particularly for the next 6 or 7 months. So how are we going to navigate through this, and what is our role as a foundation to support those leaders that are actually making decisions on the ground and showing an example of leadership for their learners in their communities?
I just wanted to jump in and just respond to Eloy, and then also just share some work that we're doing. He said something very, very profound there about the insight that leaders of color bring to their position. And and how we do hold that. And I think one of the other things that are happening in our sector, especially before this case decision happened, was we were starting to see a lot of more leaders, sort of leaders of color, come in to lead sort of large national organizations. And Rakiba, you talked about Fred. Fred is my chair, and of the Board of Independent Sector. I'm the first African American. I mean, we have so many firsts going on in our sector now. And, you know, we are particularly paying attention to what this decision means in terms of a threat to that. Because we do not want to see I think the amazing work that the sector has done over the last 40 years in terms of centering racial equity and justice, right? And leadership becomes one representation of that. And for leaders of color, particularly now, they're feeling sort of this environment that we're in now. Raising money, managing their boards, managing the complexity of the time. And we are getting ready to, we're in an election year. And so that also brings sort of a different layer of complexity. So all of this is happening at the same time, and leaders of color, it's already stressful to sort of manage a nonprofit and lead and to be a leader. And then on top of that, all these sort of other dimensions we've been talking about. So, just for the leaders of color out there that are listening, it's just important for them to know that there are people out there and institutions out there that actually like have a lot of empathy for the positions that they're in. So I wanted to say that. Now, in terms of sort of work that we're doing, I just wanted to mention one piece of research. We actually at Independent Sector, we just finished a piece of research looking at advocacy in the sector. So public policy is going to be a big part of how we sort of show up as a sector. And what we are concerned about, what I am losing a bit of sleep over, is how the nonprofit sector is leaving power on the table. 20 years ago, roughly around 60% of nonprofits participated in public policy. We're talking about a local, state, or federal level. And today that number has shrank drastically, almost 50%. About 31% of nonprofits today participate in some sort of public policy or advocacy work. And we think public policy isn't sort of a silver bullet, but it is how we work on some of these larger systemic issues that we deeply care about. And so I would love to just, talk a little bit more when we sort of get into Q&A about sort of what that means and how nonprofits can actually, use the power of public policy and advocacy to advance their missions.
I want to follow up on something that Akila said, that for nonprofit leaders, this is distracting from the work and how tragic that is. And I feel like for philanthropy, this now becomes the work. Like we are in a make or break moment. And in many ways, I think this moment is made for philanthropy. I mean, we have resources, we have networks, we can convene people, the most brilliant strategists, and they will actually show up to our meetings. So I think we need to be leaning into all our superpowers to marshal resources, marshal brain power, think about how we get from playing defense to playing offense, in terms of, and not thinking of this as simply a legal issue. This is a democracy issue. And we can't just be funding lawyers to think about this. We need to be funding organizers, culture workers, doing a turbocharged effort to, what do you call it? Like all cylinders are go, to meet the moment. And in terms of what we are doing, I am part of a motivated group of funders in the Bay Area, primarily, that are meeting with a law firm, Adler and Colvin, as well as the Lawyers Committee and MALDEF, and we are largely led by the California Black Freedom Fund to think about how we support nonprofits to navigate the quickly changing landscape. And so we are funding the creation of materials, including materials that will help nonprofits mitigate risk or think about what their exposure will be as they engage in race-conscious, race-forward advocacy and work internally and externally. We are funding webinars and in-person training, as well as a limited number of hours of legal counsel, so that groups can do a more privileged review of their policies and practices. I do underscore that a privileged review with a lawyer can help, because if you're doing an internal equity audit and creating a paper trail of everything you're doing, sometimes it's better to have a lawyer review it so that it's not discoverable in the event that you are sued. So just being aware that these are treacherous times and people may want to engage in extra precautions, and we as funders have the resources to fund that kind of legal support that nonprofits may not have budgeted for. So that gives you a sense of what we're doing, and we're happy to talk to funders in other regions to think about how they replicate or scale up the work that we're doing.
Yeah, thanks. Those were some great, some really, really great examples. Rakiba, really appreciated you sharing about some of those practices that the San Francisco Foundation currently has in place and is like putting and collaborating with other funders around. There are also a lot of questions coming into the chat, and so I'm going to start to weave some of those in that tie into some of the very things that we've been discussing. So one of the questions that came in, for instance, is someone asked, members of our board are now debating using words like equity and anti-racism, words that they previously committed to out of concern for backlash. And there's an argument that we can still do the work that matters, but use less polarizing words. There's another argument that not saying what we mean and standing by our values is disingenuous and not authentic. How are you navigating these conversations? Is there an argument to be made for doing racial equity work more subversively?
Well, I think the older I get, the more I realize everything's situational. You have to take the resources and the opportunities you have and keep moving your agenda forward in the ways that are presented to you. So, of course, I'm very fortunate. I have a board that not only wanted to move forward, but that wanted to very loudly and clearly double down on the importance of this issue. So, we issued a public statements on our website. We have gone through numerous exercises around what we mean by equity so that we're very clear about it. But not every organization is fortunate to have those types of board members, and you're not always in control of who your board members are. So you have to find ways to keep this work moving. Some of it becomes a personal choice. If the direction of board members are moving away from your fundamental belief system, then you have to make a choice. And maybe in that choice, you force a question. I've always told people in my line of work that if you're going to move an agenda like this, you have to be ready to either be fired or quit on any given day, because it is just that kind of environment. And I don't mean to say that flippantly, but I think it is situational. You have to look at what's in front of you. You have to try to move your agenda. The agenda is as well as you can, and always come back to using real life examples on the ground on why this is meaningful, not just for the sake of the argument, but for the sake of your local economies, the mission of your organization. Keep bringing it back to those issues. And then I think, that's what board members will respond to. How is this actually aligning or supporting the mission that we say that we have in the organization that we're in?
Yeah, thanks. Those are some really, powerful points around just like navigating what is a complex environment. In terms of also just like other things that people can be doing or thinking about, and knowing that legal counsel might be needed, are there other, I think Rakiba, you named some really helpful things earlier in terms of funders that were starting, funds for organizations to be able to tap into resources to do some of the work that's necessary. Are there other things that foundations or nonprofits should be doing or could be doing in this current environment if they care about racial equity or if they feel that they're under pressure?
Thanks, Alicia. And I just want to acknowledge that Bomani Johnson put in the Q&A a link to an intake form for the Lawyers Committee. So if you are looking for some legal advising, I would take advantage of that. And I think it's important to just start networking with other like-minded folks, to go to your funders and say, this is an issue that we're restless. So nonprofits, I would encourage you to go to your program officer and say, this is an issue that we want to figure out some collective strategies to address. And I also see someone in the chat who said that they're the only person of color at their organization and no one has brought up the SCOTUS decision, and that's shocking given that you work on education equity. This is the moment to get on the bus and to, make your voice heard. So anonymous attendee, I encourage you to find some allies within your organization. Maybe there are some white allies that will join with you to put pressure on your leaders to say, we need to not simply talk about this, but strategize about what this means for our mission, for the communities that we're working to support. And I think I would also encourage nonprofits to have very open and honest conversations about what your appetite for risk is. Because in many ways, the law has not changed, but there's a much more emboldened group of trolls out there that are bringing these lawsuits. And so we just need to be prepared for the fact that some of us may be exposed. And it's a kind of soul-searching moment for organizations to say, are we prepared to take this on? And I will say that at the San Francisco Foundation, we do not invite a lawsuit, but we are prepared that that is a risk, and we're still holding strong. So we as a community foundation, as Eloy can attest, California has operated under an affirmative action ban for nearly 30 years now. Community foundations have been important partners to universities and others that still want to operate race-conscious scholarship programs. So we, for example, operate an African American Initiative Scholarship Program for recently admitted Black students to UC Berkeley. And it has made a difference in whether Black people decided to go to Cal. We are also now operating a scholarship program for San Francisco State to promote Black excellence and support Black students who also can demonstrate financial need. And we did a press release and said we're about supporting Black excellence. And so we're going forward, having weighed the risks and decided that this is too important for us to just back down before we've even, been invited to the main stage fight. And so I will just close there that it's a fact-dependent, very individual decision process that leaders and organizations will have to go through to decide whether they're prepared to take this on. But I hope that as many of us as are willing and able do take it on and recognize that we may have some failures, but now is the moment to really push back and champion race consciousness.
If I could just double down on something Rakiba just said, one example here in California, and as you mentioned, we are no strangers here in California to not being able to take race as a factor of admissions. That's something we've been living under for quite some time. But, you know, we at College Future supported many organizations who made a huge push to get the University of California to drop the SAT, ACT requirements in admissions. Those are things that we can do outside of whatever the Supreme Court decides, pointing out, highlighting other practices that clearly deny access to the kind of learners that we want to see gain access. And in the latest report on applications, we have the largest number of applications to the University of California and the most diverse group of applicants to the University of California. So things can be done still, even under the SCOTUS ruling, and that's what we feel our role is as philanthropy, is to push those solutions.
You know, I'm so inspired by the solutions that were shared by my other panelists. You know, one of the things I just want to stress is we should not sort of focus all of our time on just internal organizational fighting about this, but rather what is the larger strategy here? Right? How are we going to help students? How are we going to help the BIPOC community in this particular place? Like I just don't want us to get so hyper focused on some of the more sensational parts of this. I mean, this is hard. This whole conversation is just very, very difficult to have in 2024, but we're here. And part of our job at Independent Sector is to work with philanthropic and nonprofit partners really around sort of narrative work around this. How do we talk about our sector? How do we talk about racial equity? You know, how do we continue to make the case that this is where we need to put our investment? But I am hopeful when I hear that, no, work still has to get done, right? We still have students coming up, we still have communities, housing, and how do we make sure that people who have been historically ignored and discriminated against get the opportunities that they deserve? We're not talking about people that don't deserve this. We're talking about communities that have put in the time and effort, and they have been here and they have bought into the ideals of this country. So I just want us to like just be very focused on strategy work, as opposed to work that doesn't sort of move the racial equity agenda forward.
Really appreciate that so much, Akilah. Like the focus on strategy and not losing sight of the forest for the trees, so to speak, of where it is that we're trying to go or the journey that we're headed on. So really appreciate that. I'm going to integrate a few more questions that tie into as we think about to this larger question of strategy and how, you know, we balance that with some of the things that are ongoing as well. There's some questions in the chat around specifically for organizations that are committed to supporting and helping universities bring about change. And, you know, they're aware that their language and how they describe their grants and their grant making programs can expose grantees, but they don't want to, you know, remove some of that language. How do you think about those competing pressures, or you know, just continuing and in that same vein, Eloy, in terms of higher ed, also, are there any potential impacts for the Education Opportunity Fund in colleges?
Well, on the last question, I mean, certainly there are risks to funds, any type of opportunity fund that targets affinity groups on any college campus. There's lots of conversations with legal counsels and donors, and I think you know, from our perspective, you know, one of the messages has always been do not overreact to the Supreme Court decision. Keep doing the work that you're doing. We are going to continue to provide support and put pressure on institutions not to move away from directly supporting groups of learners on college campuses. So far, we haven't seen any movement away from it. The challenge that we see is there is a softening of language. There is a questioning of new programs. There is hesitancy to act before, we check in with legal counsel. I think that's a rational reaction, but our role is to continue to push that. Fund advocacy organizations that can bring sort of the legal expertise to communities to clearly understand what is on the wrong side of the line and what is something that we just continue to push. And if somebody wants to file a lawsuit, that's their right, but we can't allow our institutions to fall victim to that kind of scare tactic. We have to keep pushing them forward. I'm fortunate. I live in California and work in California. I understand that if I was in Texas or even in Florida, that becomes a much harder push. I mean, we just saw the University of Florida's move. And in those cases, I think we have to activate alumni associations. We have to activate student organizations. We have to activate any influence group that can put pressure on that kind of decision-making as possible, because, I think it just, it is just the wrong direction. And we have to do everything we can to support those organizations that are pushing back.
I see that there's someone in the another anonymous attendee that is inviting us to get practical and talk about Section 1981 concerns. And I will add that, as many of you know, Section 1981, ironically, is a civil rights statute that was created during Reconstruction to prohibit discrimination against emancipated, formerly enslaved people. And now Edward Bloom and his crew are weaponizing it to advance these reverse discrimination claims. And so some in the chat have mentioned a few new lawsuits. There's also been a lawsuit filed against this organization in Austin, Texas, the Hidden Star organization that provides grants to women and quote unquote minorities, sort of entrepreneurship stipends. And a white male has sued, saying that it discriminates against him under Section 1981 of the Civil Rights Act. And so one thing that I see as a pattern, and again, you should consult legal counsel, is they don't like it when you explicitly, exclusively limit benefits to a protected class of folks. So if you say the program is open to all, it's not necessarily going to insulate you, but that is one way to think about avoiding Section 1981 exposure. So for example, we at the San Francisco Foundation operate a multicultural fellowship program to expose young BIPOC professionals to the world of philanthropy. It is open to all, but the overall purpose is to expose BIPOC folks. MALDEF has also mentioned that they have a program to benefit the Latinx community. It's open to all, but you have to demonstrate that your work is about benefiting the Latinx community. So focusing on the outcomes as opposed to having an exclusive target for the groups that you're trying to benefit is one strategy. Also for funders, Section 1981 prohibits discrimination in contracting. And so general operating support grants, the fewer restrictions, the better, is one point of practical advice. And so trying to make your grants just outright grants with no strings attached helps. And I want to acknowledge as well, Lori Villarosa, hey, Lori, that she distinguishes San Francisco Foundation as a bunch of progressive funders on the West Coast, but others are fighting a different sort of reality. And I just do have to acknowledge that Edward Bloom and his cronies, they're if we back down, we're giving them what they want. They're going after these high value targets and trying to establish a chilling effect. And we cannot be chilled. And so we do have to push back. And again, hit up your funders to ask for legal backup.
Let me just add to that, Ricky, but yes, we're here in California, but we went through the same situation in the 1990s when Governor Pete Wilson went on the attack on organizations and institutions. So it's not like things have always been nice and cozy here on the left coast. So we have fought through these fights, and what we're saying is you can get to the other side of this. You're just going to have to keep pushing and fighting. But we were in the same situation in the 1990s, and it was hard then to see how we would get to the other side of that, but we have.
Again, I want to sort of echo Rakiba's sentiment to seek legal counsel. With Section 1981, part of this is a technicality with Fearless. I'm using Fearless Foundation because that's one of the cases we've dug in deeply, but we are monitoring where we see these cases, sprout up across America. But it was written as a contract, and we're actually sort of looking at the language between a contract and a grant right now, and what the difference in that is, because of how robust our philanthropic sector is in this country. People have a right to give to causes that are deeply personal for them, and again, we want to uphold causes that are in line with diversity, equity, and justice, right? So this isn't sort of like a broad conversation around fund anything, but this is about funding things that are in line with this work. And so, part of it is, if you are going to do a grant versus a contract, again, seek legal counsel. If you are going to do a contract, how does that language have to look? What does it need to say? What are sort of the legal requirements of that? So there are some sort of technical aspects to this, especially the Fearless Fund case. There's some technical aspects that were, it may be a great idea for institutions, again, to seek legal counsel to make sure that they are in compliance with, Section 1981 and other sort of grant versus contractual agreements.
And I want to add, building on what Eloy said, that we in California have gotten to the other side, I would say it's complicated because, when the affirmative action ban was passed in California, it cut Black and Latinx admissions in half at some of the premier state universities. We haven't fully rebounded to the pre-Prop 209 levels, and we have tried all sorts of proxies for race, like class, and it doesn't work fully. And I think we need to, and I see people in the Q&A saying, well, what are the strategies? We don't have them yet, but we're working on it, and we need, and I guess the call to action is for us as funders to move forward and publicize the work of our grantees and ourselves in trying to tackle this issue. But we need to think of new models. Usually when a court decision like the Supreme Court's affirmative action ban comes down, I will say, we need to take it to the courts of public opinion. But the truth is, the court of public opinion was not on our side. Shortly after the ruling, I saw a poll that showed that a majority of Black and Latinx people agreed with the decision. And of course, you have to look at how those surveys were phrased and framed, but we need some completely out the box other ways to advance racial equity and support BIPOC leaders and increase BIPOC representation. We're still tweaking at the margins of old, sort of decades old models for advancing racial justice. And that's why I say too, it's a democracy issue. And my team is educating me on this call for increasing governing power among BIPOC folks and historically marginalized folks. And so it means really gaining greater power in multiple decision-making areas, including the courts, including an elected office, including in administrative agencies. So we're really creating a new kind of governing paradigm that makes it more or less likely that these kinds of decisions will come down, and we will prime the environment for a different type of policy making.
Yeah, and speaking of a different kind of policymaking, Rakiba, I think one of the good questions that came into the chat as well is around kind of looking back at some of the data, like that was shared earlier from independent sector about, that 20 years ago, 61% of nonprofits participated in public policy and advocacy work, and now only 31% participate in policy and advocacy work. Why do you all suspect there's been a decrease in this work? What are some of the things that we can do to increase it?
Yeah, I think I appreciate the question. So there's a couple of things we can do to increase advocacy. And, I hope people understand why this is such a troubling number or trend rather, and how important it is to be able to advocate and push for policies that get at the root of the systemic challenges we're working on. So one is that it's about the rules, right? So the actual rules of advocacy are very convoluted now. We may have heard this from, even some of our own funders. Oh, you can't advocate, you can't, you're going to be in violation of your sort of 501c3 status. And, nonprofits can educate and work with policymakers, and even the language and the rules, even at the federal level, that help to govern our sector aren't as clear. And so part of what we're doing at independent sector is working with federal policymakers and really pushing for clearer and explicit rules around advocacy and policy and what is admissible for nonprofits to do and not to do. So just right there, just clarity. The second thing is it's the tools, right? So one thing our research does show is nonprofits are more willing to advocate when they are in coalitions, right? So nonprofits don't want to stick their neck out, be the only one organizing or advocating on behalf of an issue, because it can make you very vulnerable to your, anybody that's opposing it. And we do live in a very politically polarizing nation right now, and I can talk about this ad nauseum. So having coalitions gives nonprofits the cover and also just more resources and support. And the numbers are stark. About 12% of nonprofits advocate on some level that don't belong to any coalitions versus 57 that do. So 57% of nonprofits that do advocate belong to coalitions. That's why they're so important. But how do you advocate? How do you reach out? And this is the other thing. A lot of nonprofits can't afford to have their own advocacy shops internally. They're expensive. They cost a lot. So being in coalitions can have a very positive impact on the potential of nonprofits to advocate. And the third thing is money. We do need to educate philanthropy, which is, part of what we're doing at independent sector, about good general operating assistance and also grants that are about advocacy. We want nonprofits working together. We want them in coalitions, but who funds coalitions, right? Who funds people sitting around a table and working on these issues with policymakers? So we need rules, we need tools, and we need the dollars to do so.
Yeah, thanks so much. That was super helpful and very, very practical advice about how to shift some of the dynamics around policy and advocacy. And I know we're coming close to the end of our time, and I wanted to make sure we had enough time for this final question, which is, what gives you hope for foundations and the field of philanthropy as we continue to navigate the aftermath of these decisions? And I think we've talked a lot about all different kinds of practices, but if there are particular ones that you like to see more of that are giving you a lot of hope these days, we would love for you to share those.
I would say what gives me hope is just seeing, this new generation of leaders, this new generation of young advocates, the way they organize, the way they share information is amazing. The way they think about what our country should look like. Just, my own experience in the California community college system, just seeing the number of women of color who lead our institutions is just 10 times greater than when I was even president of Long Beach City College. It was always confusing to me how I could be the first Latino president of Long Beach City College, how I could be the first Latino chancellor of the California community colleges. But that has completely changed. And so that gives me hope that different decisions will be made, different approaches will be taken, and there'll be a much closer connection to the students that we're serving.
I would say what gives me hope is that I'm seeing multiracial alignment to support continuing use of race-conscious policies and practices. I am a part of a multiracial team of lawyers and funders and activists who are thinking about that. And when I say team, it's not formal, but I feel like I have backup from people who are lending their talents and energy to think creatively about how we address the moment. And I'm really just proud to be at a foundation on the left coast, I will say, but that is not backing down. And so that energizes me. And the fact that folks like y'all at CEP and Philanthropy New York are continuing to convene folks. And I do think in response to some of the comments in the chat, we do need to move from talk to action, and we will. But I'm inspired just being a part of this panel.
So, I agree with both of my panelists about the hope. And somebody asked me the question about what's the difference between a grant and a contract. I tried to cut and paste the answer, and I hope I did it right because I'm not that great with all this technology stuff. So I hope I did it right. So there's a lot of things that give me hope. We're in a different time. We're not where we were 40 years ago. The conversations are different. We have more data. We have more impact. And we do have fighters out there, right? We're not just talking about it. I mean, we are trying to fight on the legal front. We're trying to educate trustees and philanthropic leaders about stay the good fight. But I have to be honest about what we do need in order to be successful in this fight. We need a marshaling of resources. Edward Bloom and his organization, they have very deep pockets. They're out there fighting on several different fronts, and we have to be more organized as a sector, and we need dollars. All this work that we're talking about doing is unfunded work. It's unfunded work because, I don't know if it's a good thing or bad thing, but one of the things about being a BIPOC leader is you know how to shake 5 cents out of anything. But that can't be our strategy for the long term. We have billions of dollars in this sector, and we have to start using it to defend the values of the sector. We do. And right now, we have not done that in mass. We have pieces of work happening, but we do need a more concentrated effort of dollars to be able to defend against the Edward Blooms, to educate and then create a communication strategy, because everything costs, and we need to be able to fight and be successful in this battle. So a lot of things give me hope, but we also need to mobilize just a lot more thoughtfully and consciously around this threat for the sector.
Well, those were super powerful words to end on. Thank you so much, Akila, Rakiba, Eloy. So appreciate your perspectives. Everyone in the Q&A, thank you so much for all your questions. So sorry we did not get to all of them. Everyone was so engaged, really appreciate it. And I want to say just there are so many great resources that were dropped into the chat. I really hope that people will look at those, utilize them, and continue in the work ahead. And I'm going to pass it back over to Sarah and really appreciate the conversation today.
Thank you, Alicia, and thank you so much to all our panelists and our partners at Philanthropy New York. We have been keeping track of those resources, and we will keep them. We will share them with the recording of today's webinar in about a week or so. So hopefully that can be helpful. I loved seeing all of the resource sharing and the Q&A. So I'd like to bring our discussion today to a close, and just please take 2 minutes if you can to fill out a survey you should be receiving in your inbox. It will really help us out so that we can continue to improve our program offerings at CEP. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time. Take care, everyone.